Don't touch her. Phoebe Grantham didn't move. She stood between two men in charcoal suits and the large grey Maine Coon, currently using her left foot as a pillow, and she did not move. One of the men reached past her, the cat's ears flattened. A sound came from her throat that was less like a hiss and more like a decision. He pulled his hand back. Then the door to the back office opened and both men stepped aside without being asked. Julian LaRue was exactly what people said about him and nothing like what they expected. 42 years old, immaculate in a dark suit, carrying the kind of quiet that only ever meant one thing. He was the most dangerous person in the room, and he'd long since stopped needing to announce it. He ran 3 shipping concerns through Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, 2 commercial real estate portfolios along the eastern seaboard, and a series of private security contracts that nobody in Halifax discussed in polite company. He also owned Quartier, the restaurant on Barrington Street, where Phoebe had been doing the books for 3 years. And apparently, he owned the cat currently sitting on her foot. Soleil, his voice was unhurried, come. The Maine Coon looked at him. She looked at Phoebe. She turned her head back toward Julian with the specific expression of a creature who had considered the request and found it unreasonable. Nobody spoke. One of Julian's men shifted. The other stared at the cat with the concentrated bafflement of someone whose job description had not prepared him for this particular situation. Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Phoebe had been the bookkeeper at Quartier, long enough to know who Julian LaRue was. Long enough to understand that the restaurant's back room operated on a different accounting ledger than the one she managed. Long enough to know when to keep her eyes on her spreadsheets and when to look at the floor. She was practical. She was quiet. She had spent most of her career being the least remarkable person in any given room, which, she'd learned, was the safest way to remain employed. None of that prepared her for what came out of her mouth next. She isn't afraid of you. Julian's attention moved to her. I know. Then you can stop calling her like she's misbehaving. The silence behind him became something textured and alive. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that has behaved outside the expected parameters of its category. Phoebe was 31 years old, built soft and full in a way she'd spent most of her 20s trying to minimize. Wearing a blouse she'd ironed that morning and sensible flats that Soleil had been using as a pillow for the past 40 minutes. She was not, by any reasonable measure, someone who told Julian LaRue what to do. And yet, she's mine, he said. At the moment, she's using my foot as a mattress. What would you like me to do about that? He studied her. Step away. I've tried that twice. She follows me. Phoebe glanced down. She's been here since yesterday afternoon. One of your men brought her in because she'd gotten loose during a delivery and nobody could catch her, and apparently my office was where she decided to stop running. Soleil yawned with magnificent indifference. Julian crouched. He reached toward the cat without commanding her, which Phoebe noticed and filed away. His hand rested near Soleil's head. The cat sniffed his knuckles, and her whole body shifted, not in alarm, not in rejection, but in the way of something that recognizes a person and is simply not ready to go. She's not sick, Phoebe said quietly. She's tired. He looked up at her. Maine Coons can get overwhelmed, all that stimulus yesterday. New people, new spaces, being chased. She needed somewhere quiet. She found it. Phoebe paused. I grew up with 2 of them. This isn't unusual. He was quiet for a moment. You know this breed. Well enough. He stood. He looked at Soleil once more, then at Phoebe, and whatever calculation was happening behind his eyes was private and fast. Leave her until she's ready, he said. Not to Phoebe specifically. To the room in general, though the room in general understood he was granting permission to someone. He left, so did his men. Phoebe sat back down at her desk and looked at Soleil, who blinked at her with large amber eyes and tucked her paws beneath her chest. "Don't look at me like that," Phoebe told her. "I don't know what just happened either." Soleil went home the next morning. Phoebe walked her to Julian's car herself, handed the carrier to the man in the front seat, and thought that was the end of it. She was wrong. 2 days later, Julian came into her office, without waiting for an answer to his knock, and sat across from her desk, as if the chair had always belonged to him. "She won't eat." Phoebe looked up from her accounts receivable. "Soleil? She's eaten the same food for 4 years. Phoebe looked around her small office, then back at Julian. "Did you bring her?" "No." "Then I can't exactly." She sat in front of her bowl this morning and looked at the door. A pause. Phoebe folded her hands on her keyboard. "Mr. LaRue." "Julian." "Julian." The name felt strange in her mouth. She kept her voice neutral. "I'm a bookkeeper. I don't have a veterinary practice. I'm not certain what you'd like me to do from here." He looked at her steadily. "You know the breed. I know how to live with them. That's not the same as treating them." She ate here. Phoebe opened her desk drawer and removed a tin of treats she kept for the restaurant's resident Tabby, who occasionally wandered up from the kitchen. She set it on the desk. Julian looked at it. Then he stood, left, and returned 9 minutes later with Soleil in her carrier. The cat walked out, inspected the office at her own pace, and ate 4 treats directly from Phoebe's palm. Julian watched this. Phoebe kept her voice even. "She's not sick. She's making a point." "Cats don't make points." Soleil stepped onto Phoebe's keyboard and sat down, rendering 3 accounts payable completely inaccessible. "I stand corrected," Julian said. He left with considerably less certainty than he'd arrived with. He came back 4 days after that. Soleil had been restless, he said, pacing, sitting at windows. Phoebe let them both in and watched the cat spend 20-some minutes methodically investigating every corner of the office before settling under the radiator with the profound satisfaction of someone returning from a long trip. There was, Phoebe observed, nothing wrong with the cat. 3 days later, Julian returned because Soleil had been pulling toward the east stairwell during her evening walk through the building. The east stairwell that connected, eventually, to the service corridor leading to Quartier's back office level. "She knows the way," Phoebe said. "She never came this way before. She does now." Julian sat. Soleil crossed the room and arranged herself beside Phoebe's chair. Julian watched the cat do this with the expression of a man who had not previously encountered a problem that didn't resolve in his favor. "You could just let her come when she wants to," Phoebe said. He didn't answer immediately. "She's a cat, not a schedule," she added. "I'm aware of what she is." "Are you? Because you keep bringing her in like there's something to diagnose." He was quiet for a moment. "She's calmer here." "Yes." "Why?" Phoebe hesitated. She hadn't planned to say what she said next. It came out anyway. "Probably the same reason you keep finding reasons to come back." The room went very still. She had genuinely not intended to say that out loud. Julian looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Soleil, who had fallen asleep. "She needs more unstructured time," Phoebe said, retreating into safer ground. "Time where nobody expects anything of her. No schedules, no routines, no structured anything. Just time to be a cat. She has everything she needs." "She has everything money provides. That's not the same thing." Something shifted in his face. Not much, just enough. After that conversation, things changed without being named. Julian didn't stop coming, but Soleil started arriving alone. One of his men would leave the carrier at the back entrance, and Phoebe would find the cat already installed beneath her radiator when she came in at 8. Julian followed later. He always had a reason, a delivery invoice to verify, a quarterly summary to discuss, a question about a sub-account that could easily have been emailed. Phoebe became less convinced by each reason. She didn't say so. She noticed other things instead. Julian drank his coffee black. He was punctual to a degree that seemed almost punitive. He had a dry, unguarded sense of humor that surfaced only when he forgot to guard it. When Soleil did something ridiculous, or when Phoebe said something he hadn't expected. She noticed that he stood in rooms the way she'd read soldiers stand. Back to walls, facing doors, his attention moving automatically to exits. Even in her small office, which contained one door and one window, overlooking a parking garage, he positioned himself where he could see both. Soleil had been exactly the same when she'd first arrived. Ears tracking every sound, body never fully at rest. Now the cat slept in the middle of the floor with her legs extended behind her, entirely unconcerned. One afternoon, while Soleil occupied a patch of sunlight with a stolen rubber band between her paws, Julian was answering messages on his phone. Phoebe was working through payroll. Neither of them was talking. She looked up. He was standing exactly as he always stood, alert, positioned. His eyes moved when the heating system clicked on. He noticed when someone's footsteps slowed outside her door. He was, she realized, always working. Even during some silence, he was working. She picked up a pen and rolled it across her desk toward him. He caught it without looking up. Then he looked at the pen, then at her. "Do something useless with it," she said. "Pardon." "Tap it, spin it, something with no point." She gestured at Soleil. "Just watch her for a minute. Don't try to get her to do anything." He stared at her. It was the stare of someone who had not been given instructions in a very long time. "When did you last do something pointless?" she asked. He didn't answer, which was, she thought, its own kind of answer. The man who complicated things was named Jamie Collard. He was the restaurant's senior dining room manager, 36, capable, and genuinely kind in the uncalculated way that didn't require effort. He had worked at Quartier for 5 years, and knew Phoebe's coffee order, her deadlines, and the fact that she forgot to eat lunch during quarter end. He left sandwiches outside her door on bad weeks. He asked her opinions on things, and actually listened to the answers. He was also, Phoebe was aware, interested in her in a way she'd chosen not to examine too carefully. Julian met Jamie on a Tuesday in October. Soleil greeted him first, walked up, sniffed his shoes, accepted a chin scratch, and leaned against his ankle. Julian, who had arrived 5 minutes earlier and was reviewing a document at Phoebe's spare chair, watched the entire exchange without expression. "Friendly cat," Jamie said. "She's selective," Julian said. Jamie glanced at Phoebe. She looked at her screen. After Jamie left, he'd come only to drop off a lunch the kitchen had made, because it was the last Friday of the month, and he knew she'd forget. Julian was quiet for a longer time than usual. Phoebe lasted about 90 seconds. "You can ask." He turned a page of his document. "I haven't asked anything." "You were thinking very loudly." He looked up. Something moved in his expression. "How long has he worked here?" 5 years. Before that. "I don't know his full resume, Julian. He's the dining room manager. He's good at his job." She paused. "He brings me lunch sometimes because I forget to eat. That's the complete extent of it." Julian returned to his document. Soleil wandered over and stepped onto his foot. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. "Don't," Phoebe said. "I didn't say anything." "You were thinking loudly again." For one moment, something close to amusement moved through his expression. Then it was gone. 2 days later, Julian arrived with lunch from a waterfront restaurant that Phoebe had mentioned once, 6 weeks earlier, in passing, as somewhere she'd always meant to try. There was enough food for 3 people. He set the bags on her desk and sat down as if this were entirely ordinary. Phoebe looked at the bags. She looked at Julian. She looked at Soleil, who was watching Julian with the focused attention of a creature who had just witnessed a confession. "This has nothing to do with Jamie's sandwiches," Julian said. "Of course not." Soleil blinked at him. "Stop it," he told the cat. The invitation came in November. A Heritage Preservation Foundation was holding its annual gala at a hotel on the waterfront, and Quartier was listed as a corporate partner because Julian had funded 2 of their restoration projects. Phoebe was included because she'd spent the better part of the past year managing the financial compliance side of those partnerships. The audit structures, the regulatory filings, the provincial certification process that hadn't existed before she'd built it from scratch. She almost declined. Events full of people who wore the same tailored jacket in 4 different colors were not her natural environment. But the work had been hers. The invitation acknowledged that. She went. Julian was already there. Of course he was. His name was engraved on the donor board by the entrance. She found a drink, found a corner, and was doing perfectly well until a woman named Genevieve Harmond introduced herself and spent the following 20 minutes introducing Phoebe to other guests as the woman who manages the accounting for one of Julian's properties. Not inaccurate, not the whole picture. Phoebe let the first 2 go. People simplified. She understood that. The third time, Genevieve was standing with a group of 4 donors and said, lightly gesturing toward Phoebe, "She keeps the books tidy. You know how important it is to have someone reliable for the detail work." A few people nodded, politely, without particular interest. Phoebe looked at Genevieve. She kept her voice completely even. "I built the regulatory compliance framework for 3 corporate partnerships with the Provincial Heritage Office. The documentation didn't exist before I created it. That work took roughly 200 hours of correspondence and filing over 14 months. Nobody laughed. Nobody was unkind. The group simply readjusted. The detail work," Phoebe added, "is the work." She moved away. Julian was standing 4 feet to her left. She hadn't seen him there. He said nothing about what he'd heard. He picked up a drink from a passing tray and fell into step beside her, as if they'd been walking together for years. A few minutes later, "She's been doing that all evening." I noticed. "She's not going to stop." I know. "I could." "I handled it," Phoebe said. He was quiet for a moment. "I know you did." Later, when the foundation chair formally recognized their community partners, Phoebe heard her name, Phoebe Grantham, whose regulatory compliance work created the framework these partnerships operate within. The chair added 2 specific details: the documentation timeline, the provincial certification that Phoebe had not provided to anyone in that room. Someone had, because Julian's name appeared in the donor register alongside that information. She found him afterward, standing apart from the crowd. "You told them." "Someone asked me what you did," I answered. She looked at him. "You didn't have to do that." "Someone was erasing the record. That required correction." He paused. "You'd already corrected the person." "I corrected the record." Phoebe was quiet. "Those are different things." "Yes," he said, "they are." She didn't ask why it had mattered to him. The evening had already shown her something she needed time with, that Julian Leroux's world recontextualized everything inside it. A cat visiting her office became his cat coming to her. An accountant became a woman in orbit around a powerful man. A private individual became a public adjacency. He could correct one room. He couldn't control every room. And she had built her own quiet, competent, unheroic life long before Julian Leroux ever walked through her office door. She didn't know yet whether she was willing to risk what that life looked like from the inside of his. After the gala, a boundary appeared that hadn't been there before. Phoebe couldn't have explained it precisely. She was still warm when Julian came. She still argued with him when he was wrong. She still let Soleil sleep under the radiator. But something had become careful in her that hadn't been careful before. A week later, on a Wednesday afternoon, she said it. "Soleil doesn't need to keep coming here." Julian looked up from a document. "She's healthier. She eats consistently. She's calmer. She has more unstructured time. Whatever she needed when she first arrived, she doesn't need it anymore. Not professionally." He was very still. "There's no professional reason to keep bringing her," Phoebe said. He looked at her for a long time, then understood. He called Soleil. The cat came, slowly, with the reluctance of someone who understood what was happening even if she hadn't been consulted. At the door, Soleil looked back at Phoebe. Phoebe didn't say anything. Julian left. He didn't return the next day, or the day after that. A week passed. Then two. The office was quieter. Her spreadsheets were undisturbed. Nobody touched the treats in her desk tin. She discovered, without planning to, that she hated quiet. She missed Soleil's weight against the radiator. She missed the particular sound of Julian reviewing documents, the slight rasp of a turned page, the low exchange with whoever waited outside her door. She missed the way he caught what she was saying before she'd finished saying it. She even missed, and this was the hardest part to sit with, watching one of Halifax's most quietly terrifying men become visibly and silently offended by a dining room manager carrying a sandwich. Jamie noticed the absence. He was smart enough not to mention it. Phoebe was grateful. She had wanted distance because she'd needed to know her life was still hers. Now she had it. Quartier was still her file. Her routines were unchanged. No one introduced her as an extension of anyone else. Nothing had been taken from her. And yet something was missing. That fact refused to arrange itself into something she could file away. Across the city, Julian had a different problem. Soleil was perfectly fine. She ate, she slept, she occupied patches of late afternoon light, and ignored him with the cheerful sovereignty of a creature who had everything she needed. Which meant Julian had no excuse, and without an excuse, he was forced to sit with an uncomfortable truth. For weeks he had told himself he went to Barrington Street because of the cat. At first, that had been accurate. Soleil had needed something he couldn't identify, and Phoebe had identified it in 40 minutes flat, and he'd kept going because the problem wasn't solved. Then Soleil had improved. Julian had kept going anyway. He had learned Phoebe's filing system without meaning to. He'd noticed that she hummed under her breath when she was running numbers, and went completely silent when she found a discrepancy. He'd observed that she was more patient with the kitchen staff than with anyone else in the building, and that she argued with the building inspector's reports as if they'd personally wronged her, and that she kept a photograph of 2 grey cats on her desk that must have been taken a long time ago. None of that was about Soleil. He'd stood in her small office when she was working, and felt, for the first time in years, that his phone could stay in his pocket for an hour, and the world would not collapse. He'd noticed who made her laugh. He'd remembered a restaurant she'd mentioned once, 6 weeks later, precisely without being asked to remember it. He'd let her remove his excuse. He'd walked out and stayed away because she'd asked him to, and because he respected her enough to understand she'd asked for a reason. But the reason she'd given was professional. The reason he'd been going back for quite some time was not. 3 weeks after his last visit, on a Thursday morning in late December, the door to Phoebe's office opened. She looked up. Julian stood in the doorway, alone, no carrier, no document in hand, no explanation offered in advance. Her eyes moved past him automatically, looking for Soleil. "She's at home," he said. "Is she?" "She's fine, eating normally," Completely fine. Phoebe set down her pen. Then why are you here? Silence. It was a different kind of silence than the ones she'd learned over months of his visits. Those had been the silences of a man thinking ahead. This one was the silence of a man who had arrived at the end of all his preparation and found himself standing in a doorway with nothing to stand behind. I wanted to see you, he said it without preamble. That's the whole of it. She waited. I spent 3 weeks trying to build a more complicated explanation. There isn't one. He crossed the room and sat down across from her desk. He looked at her steadily, and for once his expression wasn't controlled so much as simply open. I haven't been coming because of the cat for a long time. I think you knew that before I was willing to. She didn't deny it. I'd like to take you to dinner. A pause. Then something rare occurred. His voice changed slightly, became less certain and more deliberate, the way a person sounds when they are doing something without a safety net for the first time in memory. Phoebe Grantham, would you have dinner with me? She thought about the gala and everything she'd understood there. She thought about his world and what it cost to stand beside it. She thought about 3 weeks of quiet that had felt, inexplicably, like an absence rather than a relief. She said yes. Something shifted in him. Not in his expression, not in any way a stranger would have caught. But she caught it, the particular release of something that has been held tense for a very long time. He noticed that she'd noticed. Neither of them mentioned it. Several months later, on a Friday morning, Phoebe arrived at her office to find Soleil already there. Julian had taken to leaving the carrier with the building manager, who had long since stopped asking questions. Soleil had taken to behaving as though this arrangement had existed since the beginning of time. Julian arrived an hour later. He sat in his usual chair and reviewed the quarterly summary Phoebe had prepared, which was thorough and correct, because her work always was. Soleil stayed under the radiator. Some things had changed. Phoebe and Julian were together, in the careful, specific way of two people who had negotiated terms and meant them. She had not become a feature of his world. He had not brought her into his. Courtier was still her file. Her office was still her office. He'd learned to knock and wait for the answer. Some things had not changed at all. Jamie still occasionally brought lunch. Julian still regarded the arrival of those bags with barely concealed displeasure. Phoebe still found this funnier than she was willing to say out loud. And Soleil, who had started everything by choosing the least powerful person in the building to shelter with, still chose Phoebe first. Every single morning, without fail, without hesitation, without apparent awareness that any other choice was available. Julian watched the cat rearrange herself against Phoebe's ankle. She does this every time, he said. She did it the first day, Phoebe said. Some habits are the right ones. Soleil tucked her nose under her tail and went to sleep. Julian looked at the cat, then at the woman the cat had found before he'd had the sense to go looking himself. He had spent most of his adult life moving through rooms where people arranged themselves around him, carefully, strategically, always with some awareness of what he represented. Phoebe had stood in front of him on the very first day and told him, plainly, that he was handling his cat incorrectly. She'd said it without calculating what it might cost her. She'd simply been right, and she'd said so. He had built an entire empire on knowing exactly who was worth paying attention to. He had walked past the most important answer in his own building every day for 3 years. Soleil, at least, had figured that out on day 1.